Hello YouTube, it is I, Flame, coming back with some more info from Blizzcon you might have missed. Strictly speaking, we will talk about the Q&A since there were quite a few good questions being asked of the devs. This goes to show you what happens when players ask the right questions. Starting off, let's talk about the first question asked, and that is the question of choice. In patch 8.1, without going into too many spoilers, we will have a choice between siding with Sylvanas or Sourfang, as Horde of course. This type of choice brings into the game something that we didn't have for some time, player agency and repercussions for choices. Similar to this, if you remember, we had faction choices before, like the Aldor and Scryers back in TBC, but this time it seems to be a little bit different. The devs essentially said they are experimenting with this type of gameplay since they want to keep these kinds of choices impactful. We are still playing an MMO, and in my opinion, the impact of the story that we can make as players will probably be minimal in the long run or non-existing. This is of course in terms of story outcome. I doubt we will be able to choose who to have as Warchief between Sylvanas and Sourfang because, historically, MMOs do not give that much power to players, at least not to my knowledge. But choices that can impact gameplay or the viewpoint might be really interesting. If the story evolves the same way whether we side with Sylvanas or Sourfang, we might be able to see the conflict from different sets of eyes, which is a cool aspect. And since we are talking about a Warchief, if you've missed it, I feel sorry for you, but our boy Metzen was the second audience member to ask a question, and it suffices to say that Marcelian, myself, my friends, and the audience collectively lost our shits. Amongst the sea of speculations about Activision shoving their hands into Blizzard's game development, Diablo, it was very reassuring to see Metzen there. I'm not 100% sure this was happenstance, I will retain my healthy dose of skepticism, but he did ask a question. Will we see Thrall back? Of course, answering the question would mean spoiling the story and the direction of the game in future patches, so the devs kept it simple and vague, but with a nice little hook to grab onto our hopes and dreams, like telling your little kid there might still be Santa Claus out there. There might be a job opening for a Warchief, and if so, they will consider Thrall's resume. Now, discussing this possibility will be left in a separate video, which I am planning on making, but it helps us talking about another question that was asked later on. What is the difference between Sylvanas and Garish? It's no surprise that we see similarities, and at this time, I would imagine Blizzard made these similarities intentional to most likely deliver a huge plot twist later on. But of course, the answer to this was the story isn't over yet. Every time I hear this question asked in a Q&A, I always feel that Blizzard is hooking us along on their ridiculous Hate Sylvanas campaign, only to just prove us wrong in the end. I always thought they would probably do Sylvanas more like Illidan than Garish, but again, I want to talk about this at length in a future video. Moving forward to actual gameplay updates, the issue of RNG has been addressed to Ian, and he did his best to make the answer vague. I'm not hating on Ian, but I did hope that the answer would have been a bit more specific. Especially the question was addressed as, why are we seeing so much RNG when it comes to loot? And you can argue there is RNG in the item drops and a second run of RNG that determines how strong that particular item is when it drops. Ian responded with an example. To eliminate RNG and give more power to the player would mean that items would have a guaranteed drop or a way of finding themselves in your bags, maybe via vendor. Comparing it with the vendor system, if we are working steadily towards an item via currency, emblems, tokens, what have you, it would guarantee that our efforts would be rewarded, and they would be rewarded proportionally to the work we put in. But he mentioned it will take away the excitement of initially getting that piece because, you know, beforehand, days, weeks in advance, that it will drop, and I agree with this concept. RNG adds replayability, and you cannot hold a game developer with a subscription plan accountable for adding a replayability system to keep people subbed. Of course, the system itself can be criticized because if we don't, then we can end up with a case of never getting the item we want no matter how much we work for it. This is what I was left with after Ian's answer, and it felt like he was justifying the current system. That's not a problem in my eyes, but I would have hoped for some confirmation that this system is being worked upon, and in my humble opinion, the problem I have is the Warforged, Titanforged mechanic, which seems to reward players with the possibility of a big boost to the item, regardless if the effort put into getting the item can be justified or not. I don't want to seem like an elitist, but playing an RPG, regardless if it's an MMO or not, implies a level of progression, rewards and satisfaction. It's hardly satisfying busting my ass every week and finally getting an item drop from Heroic Raid when Scoob, the boob, hops into normal Uldir and gets a Titanforged version of my item that surpasses it. But this might be biased saltiness, but it's my biased saltiness, so leave me alone. On the topic of itemization, we had a talk about mythic chests being a bit random with Azurite pieces, whereas you can get the same slot every week without filling in other slots. Now, I'm not sure if this will extend to other item types, but Ian did mention they are working on something that can make it improbable for people to get 3, 4, 14 item drops in a row for the same item slot. Also, if anyone was wondering, no, we will not have class tier sets in BfA. The question was asked and the answer was clear. They are trying to add tier sets oriented more to the type of content you do as opposed to the class you are playing. Raid items will have a look similar to the environment they drop from, and this applies to dungeons, PvP and quests. They did mention that this type of system is not definitive and tier sets might return in future expansions. Moving on to GCD. Yes, more awareness raised on this issue. The reason they reinstated GCD so predominantly back into our classes was to eliminate a gameplay system where you would stack abilities in macros, with which I completely agree. The downside is that we have a few main issues. When it comes to offensive combat, for certain classes it takes 4 to 5 seconds of constantly activating skills before they can start their burst rotation. For tanks and defensive combat in general, the reactiveness of the spec is taken away when you take that big chunk of damage, or at least see it coming, but the GCD prevents you from reacting in time. And same goes to movement skills. They did mention this will be improved as the expansion goes on. As such, we are seeing stuff like Ignore Pain being taken off of the global cooldown for protection warriors. When it comes to reactive abilities that promote good reflexes or premeditary action that comes from knowledge of the game, such as predicting a big hit coming your way and reacting before it hits you, I completely agree that we should have these off the global cooldown. Maybe with their own GCD system, but this just sounds way too messy. But in my humble opinion, I don't think the actual GCD system is wrong, but the fact that the GCD is so long that causes problems. Maybe shorten the overall GCD or make haste more impactful on it? Good? Bad? You decide. This is pretty much it when it comes to actual important stuff discussed about the game. There have been questions about the story and Sylvanas, about classic WoW, which I will cover in another video as well, and there have been questions about transmogging different armor types for classes that cannot inherently wear them, so I choose, out of respect for you the viewer, to leave them out. As such, if you have specific questions yourself that you want to ask, feel free to add them to the comment section and I will do my best to answer them in turn. Gratitude for sticking around to the end of the video. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this stuff, and I will see you in the next one.